Welcome to Memory Settings. SQL Server has a few memory settings available to you. Minimum server setting, the maximum server setting, the index creation memory setting, and the minimum memory per query setting. The minimum server memory setting is one of the most commonly misunderstood settings within SQL Server. What people think this setting does is tell SQL Server how much memory to use as soon as it starts. That is not what the setting does. What this setting actually does is tell SQL Server when to stop giving memory back to the Windows operating system. So say we've got a server that's got 64 gigs of RAM, and we set the minimum memory setting for that instance at 10 gigs, because that's the minimum amount of memory that SQL Server needs to run our app in some sort of acceptable performance level. Not great performance, but we can live with it while whatever is going on is going on. So we set the minimum server setting to the 10 gig mark. So as Windows is telling SQL Server that it needs to get memory back, SQL Server will give memory back as instructed. Once SQL Server gets down to the 10 gig mark, SQL Server will then stop giving memory back to the Windows operating system. The maximum server memory setting is fairly well understood. It tells SQL Server what the maximum amount of memory for buffer pool and procedure cache is. Now, in previous versions of SQL Server, the maximum and minimum memory settings only impacted the buffer pool and the procedure cache. In SQL Server 2012, there's a couple of other things that fall within that setting as well. For example, the amount of memory used by the SQL Server CLR is now controlled through the minimum and maximum server settings. This is because the internal memory manager of SQL Server has been completely rewritten so that lots of other things can use the minimum and maximum server settings. The index creation memory is set to 0 by default, which means that it's a dynamic setting. In reality, you probably want to leave this setting alone. You don't want to cap the amount of memory that SQL Server can use for index creation because you want it to use as much memory as necessary so it can get the job done as fast as possible. The minimum memory per query setting, for the most part, doesn't need to be changed either. This setting is going to tell SQL Server how much memory to allocate each user. If your users are running incredibly large, complex queries that need more memory, you can adjust this setting as necessary. In most workloads, the default setting works just fine. Let's go ahead and take a look at these memory settings and how to make adjustments to these settings in Management Studio and in T-SQL. You can see here we've got Management Studio connected to a SQL Server instance. We're going to go ahead and right-click on the instance and go to Properties. On the Memory tab, we can see those 4 memory settings that I mentioned earlier. So this particular server has 48 gigs of RAM in it. So we're going to go ahead and set the minimum memory setting to 10 gigs, or 10240 megabytes of memory. For the maximum server memory, we'll go ahead and set that at 20 gigs, 20480. We're going to set it at such a low number, maybe because we have other things running on this particular server. Now, once we click OK, the memory settings are going to be changed right away. If we've increased the amount of memory available to the buffer pool by increasing the maximum server memory, SQL Server is going to be able to use that memory basically immediately. If we've lowered the setting like we have here, and SQL Server needs to remove memory from the buffer pool and the plan cache in order to meet the requirements of the new setting, it may take a few minutes for that to happen. There's no need to restart the SQL Server engine to make these settings take effect. They do take effect right away, although they can take a few minutes before SQL Server gets to these settings that you've specified. Now I can click OK and make these settings active, or I can click the script button and get a T-SQL script that tells me what these settings look like in T-SQL. Let's go ahead and click Cancel and take a look at that. So you can see here I've got execute, sys.spconfigure, min server memory, and then the min server memory setting in megabytes. I've got the same for the max server memory, and then I've got a reconfigure statement, in this case with override. That'll tell SQL Server to go ahead and reconfigure the instance and use these new settings. So in summary, the minimum and maximum memory settings are going to be different for each server, depending on the amount of memory on the server, the databases on the server, the other software running on the server, and various other things that are running on the server. The settings are going to be very dependent on whatever other software happens to be running on the server. You don't want to just have some corporate standard that says that this is what it's going to be on all machines, because not all machines are created equal. Remember, there is no restart necessary to change the memory settings. This is a myth that's gone back a long time because back in the good old days, you did need to do this. This is not necessary anymore. You can change the memory settings as often as you'd like without any impact to the server, other than the fact that the buffer cache and the plan cache are going to need to be adjusted.